Italian campaign, brought to you by the Freedom for Italy network, the Ardeatine Caves massacre with my special guest, James McFarlane. But first, a roundup of events in Italy 80 years ago this week. On the 17th of March, Mount Vesuvius erupted, killing 26 civilians, destroying 88 American aircraft, and displacing 12,000 Italians. On the 22nd of March, the OSS dispatched saboteurs from Sardinia to destroy tunnels between Levanto and Bonasola on the Genoa to La Spezia railway line. 15 of the team were captured on the 24th of March before carrying out their mission. They were shot 2 days later under Adolf Hitler's 1942 commando order that Allied commandos should be executed without trial. On the 23rd of March, Operation Strangle air interdiction operations were launched to cut routes north of Rome to prevent supplies reaching German forces in central Italy and compel them to withdraw. In the following 8 weeks, the Allies were to fly 21,000 sorties and drop 22,500 tons of bombs over a 150 square mile area from Rome to Pisa and from Pescara to Rimini. On the 24th of March, Ivano Bonomi resigned as chairman of the National Liberation Committee, which had been formed by 9 non-fascist political parties on the 9th of September 1943. That was prompted by divisions about whether King Victor Emmanuel should abdicate and calls for the deposition of the Italian monarchy. A former prime minister and a moderate, Bonomi had found refuge since September in the papal cathedral of St. John in Lateran in Rome. He was to return as chairman in May, following the Italian Communist Party's decision to support a moderate approach to Italian affairs after the war. Bonomi was appointed prime minister in the government of the Kingdom of Italy in June, following the liberation of Rome. On the 23rd of March 1944, on the 25th anniversary of the creation of the Italian Fascist Party, an improvised bomb was detonated as a column of the 3rd Battalion of the police regiment was marching through Rome's Via Rasella. The battalion had been raised in October 1943 from German speakers of the northern Italian province of South Tyrol, which had been annexed to the Third Reich after Italy's armistice with the Allies. Its members had seen action in the Royal Italian Army on the Eastern Front and had chosen service in the SS rather than another tour in the East with the Wehrmacht. The blast instantly killed 28 policemen. 2 civilian bystanders were also killed, although one of them, Piero Zuccheretti, aged 11, might have been killed by the Germans firing in response to the attack. The attack was carried out by 12 members of the Communist Party allied Gruppo d'Azione Patriottica. An improvised device consisting of 12 kilos of TNT in a steel case was inserted in a bag containing a further 6 kilos of TNT and TNT-filled iron tubing. It had been hidden in a rubbish cart and pushed into position by a partisan disguised as a street cleaner. The fuse was lit when the police were 40 seconds from the bomb. The 12 escaped after the blast. The German police attaché and commander of the security police in Rome, SS Obersturmbannführer Herbert Kappler, was on the scene soon afterwards to supervise the investigation. He was summoned that evening to the headquarters of the German Armed Forces Commandant in Rome, Luftwaffe Generalmajor Kurt Melzer. They agreed that the execution of 10 Italians for each German policeman killed was a suitable ratio. Melzer, who also proposed burning down part of Rome, passed this on to General Eberhard von Mackensen, commander of the 14th Army. He endorsed the recommendation. Commander-in-Chief South Field Marshal Albert Kesselring interpreted this as calling for the execution of Italians who had previously been sentenced to death. He was told by Kappler that sufficient prisoners were available, but that there were only 4 with death sentences at SS headquarters in the German embassy on 145 Via Tasso. The number was made up by 17 serving long sentences, 167 deemed worthy of death, and 2 to 4 civilians who had been arrested in the Via Rasella area on suspicion of involvement in the attack. Kappler's superior Wilhelm Haster suggested making up the numbers from the 57 Jews also in Nazi custody. By noon on the 24th of March, Kappler had a list of 271 victims. The death toll from the Via Rasella bombing eventually reached 33. To make up the numbers, chief of the fascist police in Rome, Questore Pietro Caruso, offered Italians from the Regina Coeli prison. Because Hitler had ordered the reprisal within 24 hours, the victims were to be shot in the back of the head at close range rather than firing squad. The operation was led by SS officers Erich Priebke and Karl Haas. The killings were carried out in the tunnels of the disused quarries of Pozzolana near the Via Ardeatine on the 24th of March. A total of 335 Italian prisoners, 5 in excess of the 330 called for, was transported to the Ardeatine Caves in trucks, then killed inside in groups of 5. During the killings, the existence of the 5 extra prisoners was discovered. It was decided to kill them anyway to prevent the place of execution becoming known. The bodies of the victims were sealed in the caves by a detonation. Their families were notified by an individual letter or not at all. The victims comprised rich and poor, doctors and lawyers, workers and shopkeepers, artists and artisans, teachers and students, men and teenage boys from every walk of life, and even a man of God among them. Some were residents of Via Rasella who were home at the time of the partisan attack. Others had been arrested and tortured for suspected resistance and other anti-fascist activities, while others had been picked up on the streets or arrested at their homes on the basis of tips from informants. 75 of the victims were Jewish. The youngest was 15. Political prisoners who were executed included members of Gruppo d'Azione Patriottica and the monarchist clandestine military front of the resistance, which included policemen. Members of the Bandiera Rossa dissident communist resistance group constituted the largest number. The victims included Padre Pietro Pappagallo, one of the models for the character of Padre Pietro in Roberto Rossellini's 1944 film Rome, Open City. Colonel Giuseppe Montezemolo, who had been hiding in Rome and organized and led the clandestine military front of the resistance representing the Bergoglio government. He had been captured and tortured. General Simone, a war hero aged 64, who had also been tortured before he was shot. 4 other generals, all members of the clandestine military front, were among the executed. The slaughter became a symbol of the massacres of civilians in Italy from September 1943 until the German surrender in May 1945. The Fossa Ardeatine monument was inaugurated in 1949. All responsible for the Ardeatine massacre were eventually caught, tried and sentenced. Pietro Caruso was tried for numerous crimes, sentenced to death on the 21st of September 1944, and executed by a firing squad in the courtyard of the Fort Brevetta in Rome. In September 1946, Meltzer was sentenced to 10 years in prison by an American military court for parading US prisoners of war through the streets of Rome. His sentence was reduced to 3 years on appeal. But on the 30th of November 1946, Meltzer and Mackensen were sentenced to death by a British military court at the University of Rome. Casarin was sentenced to death on the 6th of May 1947. His sentence, as well as Meltzer's and Mackensen's, were commuted to life imprisonment shortly thereafter. Meltzer died in Vale Prison in March 1952. Wilhelm Haster was convicted and sentenced to 12 years for his role in the deportation and murder of Dutch Jews in 1949. He was released in 1953. In 1967, he was tried and sentenced to an additional 15 years in jail for the deportation of Jews to Auschwitz and Sobibor concentration camps. He was given credit for time served and was pardoned in 1969. Harster died in 1991. Herbert Kappler was sentenced to life in prison in 1947. He escaped from prison in August 1977, not long before he died of cancer. Erich Priebke escaped to Argentina but was finally extradited to Italy in 1996, where he was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1998. He died while under house arrest on the 11th of October 2013. Karl Haas also fled to Argentina but was extradited to Italy to testify against Priebke. He was sentenced to life in prison in 1998 for his role in the Ardeatine massacre. Haas was held under limited house arrest in Switzerland until his death in 2004. On the 24th of March, Royal Irish Fusiliers Captain Lawrence Franklin Vale wrote to his wife Olive in the UK from Capua, where he and his battalion had been preparing to join the Third Battle of Cassino. I am writing this letter in the sun. It's a beautiful day, clear blue sky, and the countryside is beginning to look very pleasant. The mountains, some of them snow-topped, present a magnificent sight. It is very much a case of all prospects please and only man is vile. The thunder of our guns, the drone of our planes, and the heavy anti-aircraft fire of the enemy all seems strangely incongruous under such surroundings. What a life! I suppose one day we will return to normal conditions. Yet, curiously enough, war has done me well. It is the most brutal, bestial, and senseless business, but since I joined up in November 1939, I have on the whole had very little cause to complain. Occasionally, certain events have annoyed me, and I have sometimes had a disappointment or setback, but on the whole, I've got on pretty well. Look after yourself, precious. But remember, I love you far beyond everything in the world. Give my little daughter a great big kiss and hug from her daddy. All my love and kisses to you both, Lawrence.
I don't claim to be an expert, but at least I've been to everywhere on that you mentioned, including Forte Brevetta. And you talk about what it means today. And I just want to mention one of the trials. You mentioned a lot of trials of the perpetrators. I want to mention another trial to illustrate how controversial this whole subject can be. There's a trial in 1949, where the people who got injured in Via Rosella and the relatives of the victims of the Ardeatine Caves sued the Gap. Okay, they tried to claim damage.
Let's get back to that, James, because first of all, I just want to talk about you a little bit. Take a minute. You live in Italy. How long have you been living in Italy, and when were you there?
Pardon me. I've been living in Italy for 20 years. I was working in computers for a long time. Loved it. Loved the company I worked with. Traveled the world. Always came back to Rome. Fantastic city. When I had time on my hands, I took up an old hobby of mine, which is World War II. I've been to World War II museums in Moscow, in Kiev, Tokyo, in the States, in UK, pretty much a lot of places. But the place I found really fascinating is Rome. And one thing that you feel and you see when you're in Rome is we have millions of visitors and very few people are familiar with these stories that we're talking about here. Of all these, for me, the Italian campaign is absolutely fascinating. It's got an incredible cast of characters when we talk about the Japanese Americans here, the Maoris, the Poles, the Tuskegee Airmen, and the setting of Italy with all the beautiful places here and the city of Rome itself. And when we hear the stories like this, we can learn from all these stories. And so I find it a fascinating campaign, and I think it's very much neglected. This way, I'd like to see more and more people knowing more about it.
Good. And you help people to locate key locations in Rome, don't you? That's
one thing I was doing was a friend of mine's tour guides, and I've been explaining to them and been acting sort of historical consultant. I've been showing people around the Roman Forum, Capitol Hill, the Jewish ghetto, and to be able to go with them, people who've spent 20 years showing people around and saying, did you know this is where General Mark Clark did this? Do you know that this is the monument to this? And so, yes, I'm working with people in the tourism business to try and get more of the tour guides aware of this history, because it's not even part of their standard exams for being a tour guide in Rome. It doesn't even exist as part of it.
Okay, well, let's now go to the Ardeatine Caves issue. And I went through the facts. Now, what about the contemporary resonance? How well is it remembered, and how is it remembered?
Okay, looking through how things are going to come up this weekend, and I was watching out. There's going to be concerts. There is an Ardeatine Massacres symphony written by an American guy, I think Schumann. And Riccardo Muti, you may be familiar with, very famous orchestra conductor. He was with La Scala Milan. He's in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He's going to be in Rome conducting that as part of the anniversary. I'm watching out for whatever other things they do, but it is usually remembered. And 20 years ago, we had President George W. Bush and Silvio Berlusconi go down there for the 60th anniversary. I haven't seen similar events planned so far for the 80th, but I'm watching out for it. Okay, it is the 80th, and I say the commemorations that I've been spotting have been more from the Communist Party, pushing that for reasons. Last year, on the 79th anniversary of the liberation of Rome, I went down to the British Commonwealth Cemetery for the 79th commemoration, June the 4th, and the National Partisans Association had a march through, and one of the banners is Remember Via Rosella, honor to the Gap, and that's their thing, but other partisan groups may disagree with that. I've not seen the official ceremony mentioned so far, but as I say, concerts are taking place. There will be definitely a commemoration. The Mayor of Rome usually attends, and others. I haven't seen the agenda so far, okay? If you look at the major organizations like the monarchists who you mentioned with Colonel Montezemolo, and I would also point to the socialists and working with Peter Tompkins, who was the American spy in Rome. Their goal was to collect intelligence and provide that intelligence to the allies down at Anzio, down at Cassino. So the Socialist Party had all their members in the train stations, on the roads, watching all the German traffic, watching the divisions going through, reporting it back to Tompkins, rating it down to the allies. They wanted peace and quiet in Rome, as did the others, the monarchists, whatever. But outside, it was fair game. So if you look at Bandiera Rossa, they were the ones who were really acting in the countryside. They were doing a lot of attacks on German convoys. They had spikes, which they laid on the road to block the traffic, and then they would coordinate with the Allies. Initially, not so closely, but the further they went on, the Allied cooperation got better, so the Allied airplanes would come in and attack the convoys once the people outside Rome had blocked them. And that was more Bandiera Rossa. Well, the communists were a little bit of a step apart from the rest. So even though they took part in CLN, the National Liberation Committee, with the other 8 parties that you mentioned, they were always doing their thing, and they were never under the rules. It was only the point you've mentioned when the communists turned and became part of the government, in a sense, was the turning at Salerno, when they basically got a message from Moscow, become part of the main thing. Why they acted the way they did in Rome was, I think, they were independent and they believed it was making a distant difference. And in many ways, they did do some good things. They stole plans, they disturbed, but everybody knew that the repercussions of their actions were hurting the people in Rome. And most of the people in Rome were more interested in just surviving and hoping that the war would pass them as soon as possible. So if you go from the top with like the Pope, all the Pope wants to see is the battle to go beyond Rome and no damage. The Germans, they don't want to see trouble in Rome. They've got enough things on their hands in Anzio and in Cassino, and there are only 1,500 German troops in Rome. There's not a lot, so they want things quiet, and they're working with the Vatican to keep things quiet. And then the communists are coming along and they're stirring things up. And if you read, for example, there's a book by Jane Scrivener, who's an American nun in Rome. That's her pen name. And she talks about the repercussions just in terms of the curfews changing, When the Gap attacked Regina Coeli prison on a bicycle, then bicycles were then banned. And so even after the Ardeatine Caves massacre, the curfew was brought forward even earlier, the bread ration was reduced, and people were just trying to survive. And so they would much preferred it to be outside of Rome and not affecting their day-to-day survival.
So this operation was approved at the highest levels of the communist. Well, Togliatti, who was the leader of the Italian.
Togliatti was in Moscow.
Just going to come back to Italy, but was it approved at the highest levels in Italy?
From Amendola, yes. In fact, Amendola, who's the head communist in Italy at the time, he was having a meeting at the time that the bombs went off, and with somebody from CLN, I'll remember the name in a minute. And when he heard the bombs, they said, "Oh, that's one of ours." You know, he was
Right.
very much aware of it. Okay, if you were to look at the website of the Museum of the Liberation in Via Tasso, which is the old Gestapo headquarters, they specifically say that Adolf Hitler wanted 50 Italians for every German, and then they had to talk him into being 10. Other people say, well, you know, where's the actual order? You know, can you actually prove that? And when you put somebody like Meltzer or Mackinson, whoever, on a trial, aren't they going to say we're obeying orders? So did it come from local as a suggestion to Hitler and came back as an order? It's debatable. But, you know, obviously Hitler did in the end approve it and say 24 hours, I want these 10 Italians for every one German. Where the original idea came from, it might have been Meltzer in the street in Rome. But so it's debatable.
Okay, well, Kesselring, who was the supreme German commander in Italy, he was definitely in the picture, wasn't he? And he was held amongst other crimes, he held responsible after the war, wasn't he? Is that fair?
No, he was held responsible, but General Alexander and the British, they treated him as a good adversary, and they put in a good word for him. He was one of these people who believed that there was a correct way to have a war. There were standards you had to behave, and he saw partisan warfare as not going by the rules. You know, the Geneva Convention, which is what, as we mentioned, I think it was Mackinson got in trouble for parading the American prisoners through Rome. Those mattered to Kesselring, and he was always treated the people like Bandiera Rossa, like the Gap, as terrorists. That's the way he viewed them. He did not see them as legitimate soldiers. And so when it came to it, the British generals, the American generals, put in a good word for him, even though he was sentenced to death for things he got up to, you know? If I just kind of could take a step back with Meltzer, the King of Rome, and Paul also brings in why the Gap were doing this. The Gap were doing all the actions in Rome, and a lot of their actions were against the fascists. They regularly shut up the fascist parades, and so once the Germans came back took the city, the fascists who'd been sort of expelled after the fall of Mussolini, and many imprisoned in Forte Boccea, the German paratroopers released them, and they're back on the streets and they're causing trouble, and they're the ones who are hunting down Jews. They're the ones who are torturing many partisans in the resistance. If you look at Maurizio Giglio, who worked with Peter Tompkins on the American Spy Network, he was caught by the fascists and tortured by them. He wasn't at Via Tasso. He ended up as a victim at the Ardeatine Caves, but he was not never really in the German hands. And the Gap were fighting constantly against the fascists. And the date, as you correctly said, 23rd of March, is the 25th anniversary of the fascist foundation in Milan. And every year, the fascists have made a big fuss of it at the Adriano Theatre, which is north of Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome. But this year, the Germans, who, again, they wanted Rome to be quiet. They didn't want trouble. They had enough things on their hands. They insisted that the fascists held it in Mussolini's Palace of the Corporations. Now, this is important because the Palace of the Corporations is on the Via Vittorio Veneto. Between Meltzer's hotel, the Excelsior Hotel, and the Palace of the Corporations is just the American Embassy. It's 2 minutes walk. All the major generals from the German army are on that. It's the most expensive hotel street in Rome. If you were to go there today, you'd be talking $500, $400 a night. at low for the cheapest room, and that's off season. And so, whereas they would normally have had it on the other side of the room, they're having the big party to celebrate 25 years of fascism just next to Meltzer, who's having his drinks at the Excelsior Hotel. The bomb is 5 minutes away from them, which is why Meltzer can turn up a little drunk, which is what everybody was frequently reported, because he'd been enjoying it. When you look at a lot of the other German officials and the fascist officials, they're turning up from their party. They're enjoying themselves 1 minute, they're shocked. The Gap wanted to shock them. But part of their reaction was just this whole, they heard it right next to them. It was immediate, it wasn't the other side of town. And at a moment that they were not prepared for it. And I think that, in a sense, to go from Meltzer enjoying his lunch to looking at limbs in the street and people dying in the street, I think that really did make a reaction which maybe made them react even more strongly than they would otherwise. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi, no doubt about it. And the idea that the way Richard Burton portrayed him as having a conscience, thinking that Germany would lose the war and wondering what's going to happen afterwards. No, after the Ardeatine massacres, he cracked down harder. You take areas of Rome like Quadraro, the area of Rome, which is near Cinecittà, round up 6,000 Italians deported to Germany because they're causing trouble. He cracked down hard, you know. It is a massive issue and it resonates today. And the first thing I would say, going back to Massacre in Rome, is the guy who wrote the book is a guy, Robert Katz, okay? He was an American journalist and he worked at the United Nations in Rome. If you know, the Food and Agriculture Organization have got a big office in Rome, gigantic by the Circus Maximus. And he wrote actually a few books on Rome, and Death in Rome was the book he wrote in 1967. And this became the film with Richard Burton in 1973, okay? Shortly after that, they were all sued by the relatives of Pope Pius XII. So Pope Pius XII is Eugenio Pacelli. The Pacelli family be part of the nobility of Rome. So when it was Princess Pacelli sued him, they spent 2 years in court. That's him with the director, whose name I can't remember, and the producer is Carlo Ponti. And at the end of those 2 years, Robert Katz, the author of the film Massacre in Rome, was given 14 months in prison for defaming the Pope. And the producer and the director got 6 months each. They appealed, and they actually, in the end, it was all dismissed, but that was part of a general amnesty. So it's not as if they were completely absolved. There was general amnesty, so they were taken no further. But after 2 years, somebody thought it was worth saying to them, you shouldn't be in prison because this is not what the Pope was doing. Okay?
Okay, so, and then obviously, I mean, the Scarlet and the Black is not actually, the Via Rasella massacre is not mentioned. It doesn't actually figure at all in it. But Kappler is in it. I assume the producers and the script writers decided don't mention Via Rasella because we can finish up in prison if we say the wrong thing. So,
their issue was more the how they pictured the Pope in the Massacre in Rome. If you take how the Pope is depicted in the Scarlet and the Black, I think it's much more true to life that he's a very conflicted guy who's just trying to keep things quiet and not cause trouble. And he's being criticized from that in a lot of quarters, and understandably so, that he didn't speak out more about the Holocaust. But this is a massive topic, and it's one of the things that is even today is under discussion. It was like about 3 years ago, Pope Francis opened up the Vatican archives because it's such an issue, a discussion point. A lot of people saying, hey, the Pope should have spoken out more, he should have done more. And other people saying, well, if he'd have spoken out, it could have made it worse, which did happen in some countries, where he spoke out in Holland about the persecution of the Dutch Jews, and that led to a crackdown on the Catholic Church. The Pope, Pius XII, we know, was very concerned about communism. He'd been the nuncio in Munich, in Germany. He'd been there during the Munich Soviet, and he'd been attacked by the communists. He had a big fear of the communists in the Soviet Union. He's a very complex character. And as I say, the Pope Francis opened up the archives March 2020, so that people could investigate and actually look at the letters and try and put more light into his actual position on these things. But as of now, 3 years later, there's nothing really major come out to explain what his motivation was. And so that research carries on with people criticizing and people defending him from being what was a very difficult position. And if you think about the Vatican archives, just as a thought, the Vatican archives, which were opened, the archives consist of 85 kilometers of shelves of books. This is not a small amount. So 50 miles worth of shelves is what's in the Vatican archives. So how long they're going to take to find anything is an interesting question. But people are looking into that. It is something that's happening right now to explain the position of the Pope, if it ever can be explained. The guy who was actually curator of the Vatican archives, Sergio Pagano, he resigned about a week or two ago, retired, pardon me. And he was sort of saying the Pope took his secrets to the grave, that we don't really know what motivated his actions. So on the whole, I think the Massacre in Rome film is a lot more fair to him and a much more accurate picture.
Scarlet and the Black.
Bam, you got me.
The Gregory Penn. The Gregory
Penn and Christopher Plummer, absolutely.
That's right. And now we go down the food chain. So at the bottom, the Pripyat Has. I mean, this is it's another story. This is just another, because they went to Argentina. The Pripyat Has, they got to Argentina. And that is the old rat line, and that's Alois Hudel, who was the Vatican official. And that takes us into another set of Hollywood movies, Boys from the Brazil and other such things, in which the Nazis. So what does history say now about how those guys got to Argentina, and why did it take so long for the Italian authorities to do anything about them?
Well, it's not just the Italian authorities, and the key thing is that the Cold War, the onset of the Cold War, changed everything, and that it was no longer priority. And we mentioned a moment ago the Svolta of Salerno when Togliatti changed the position of the Italian Communist Party. That was because Churchill and Stalin had sat there, drawn up a map of Poland, of Europe, and said, Poland's on your side, Italy's on our side, Greece is on our side, Romania's on your side. At which point the British Army had to fight a campaign in Greece to stop the communist takeover. And in Italy, the only thing that mattered was stopping a communist takeover. And a lot of things which should have gone punished were unpunished. And as we know, a lot of people ended up in America and other places who should have been punished, but they were seen as being useful in the Cold War environment. And it was only years and years later that people like Klaus Barbie from France were being put on trial. And so when we look at the particular Italian thing, the Italian situation, and again, there's a fascinating thing about Rome, is Rome was really the heart of the rat lines, the most important rat lines. You correctly mentioned Alois Hudel. His church, Santa Maria dell'Anima, is just up Piazza Navona. In the archives of that church, you will find, or has been found, the resumes, the curriculum vitae of people like Otto Stangl, Klaus Wagner, I think they're around. Basically, the commandants of Treblinka and Sobibor extermination camps, who were helped to escape to Argentina and Syria and other places. I think it was Wagner went to Syria. When we talk about Pripka was actually in British custody for a while, and he was held as a suspected war criminal. He managed to get out with assistance, and I think he is one of the. I think he actually does point to Alois Hudel as one of the people who helped him to get to South America. And the interesting thing about Pripka is, okay, he changed his name when he was getting to South America, but after that, he went back to using his real name, Eric Pripka, and he lived under his real name for nearly 50 years, which again raises a lot of questions. That how nobody there was making any sort of issue of it, but what actually is the almost crazy thing about it is the reason Pripka was caught was an American television company, ABC 60 Minutes, which I think is still running today. They had a reporter called Sam Donaldson. They'd had a number of stories about Nazi war criminals being tracked down, because we had people like Simon Wiesenthal, trying to track down Nazi war criminals. You mentioned the films that had kind of brought it back into the public view. And they sent a film crew with Sam Donaldson down to Bariloche in Argentina just to walk around and say, do you know any of these guys? Do you know anybody who's their background? And they said, go and speak to that guy. Sam Donaldson walks up to Eric Priebke in Bariloche, Argentina, and as many an American or British person does when addressing a German speaker who lives in a Spanish-speaking country, he immediately spoke to him in English and said, are you Eric Priebke? Were you in the Gestapo in Rome? Priebke replied and spoke in English, and he admits it immediately. He says, yes, I was in Rome, yes. Yes, there were terrorists and we dealt with them. It was war, you wouldn't understand. Priebke, incidentally, his English is very good because he used to work as a waiter at the Savoy Hotel in London, which is where he learned his English. But still, it's quite something. 50 years later, he can switch into English. And he had, listening to him, he had no regrets. For him, it was war, it's what you were told to do. And the outcry, once that interview went onto American television in Italy, was why the hell isn't this guy back in Rome in prison like Kappler and like all the others? What the hell has been going on? But it wasn't, as I say, it wasn't an Italian initiative, a government initiative. It was an ABC television news initiative. And so that interview, I think it was 94, and they bring him back in 98. So it took a little while to get the extradition treaty going because I think between Argentina and Italy, there wasn't one, but it took him a couple of years to get him back. And the trial took place in 1998. So again, we're talking over 50 years after the massacre. And he basically got house arrest in Rome. He died in 2013, and he's buried in an unmarked grave because the trial was quite controversial, and there were actually fascist groups went out and supported them. And so to make it that they didn't have a shrine or something, they didn't say where he was buried after that. So that's Priebke. Haas was brought in as a witness on the trial, etc. But the Priebke story, the fact that he could carry on so long in another country under his real name, is quite stunning in many, many ways. But the entire priorities of the West were the Cold War, and which is why, again, if you think of Rome, you think of Croatia, for example, the Ustashi cabinet who ran Croatia, virtually the entire cabinet of Croatia, the government, including the leader, they passed through Rome on the way to South America, you know? And partly because Iran, sure.
Absolutely. And we mentioned Haas, who was the other part of he was brought in to testify against Priebke, then was prosecuting himself. He also died. He was never, I think he was convicted on house arrest, but at which point these men were in their 90s. And they died quite recently. I mean, you know, I could have met and sat down and had a cup of tea with them and, you know, talked over about the whole thing. I mean, it's quite recent. One other thing, Pietro Caruso was the police chief, and he was the first one shot. He was convicted by Italian court and shot, but not just for the Ardeatine Caves. Anything you can say about Pietro Caruso?
Well, Caruso, Pietro Caruso, I mean, he came back, it was obviously fascist war. He came back to Rome once the Germans had come in, and he came in as police chief. The day he actually arrived, he was walking down Via Nazionale, the main road in Rome. The Anzio landings had happened. He got caught up in the roundup where the Germans just took every Italian, able-bodied Italian, and sent them down to dig defenses down at Anzio. And he had to talk his way out of that. After that, he gets on with running his as police chief of Rome. I would point also to Pietro Koch, who worked with him, who led a lot of the fascist gangs who were hunting down the partisans. And they were the ones who captured and tortured Maurizio Giglio, who was working with Peter Tompkins on the Allied radio, which was so important to the Allies at Anzio. When Caruso was caught, he was fleeing Rome. He was heading towards Lake Bracciano. He got his car was hit by a bomb blast from a plane. He was recognized in hospital and sent back. So he was pretty much captured soon afterwards, and he was shot at Via Forte Bravetta. Forte Bravetta, if you go there, they've got the monument to the martyrs. There's not much else there, because most of the the partisans were shot there. The Ardeatine Caves was obviously the exception. It was typically standard practice. Take them to the Ardeatine Caves and shoot them. But then they did the same to Pietro Caruso, and they did the same to Pietro Koch at the Forte Brevetta, which I've been to.
Okay, well, we can talk more about the internal politics of Italy, because this is a real turning point. March 1944 is a turning point with the return of the Communist Party Secretary, the shift in the Communist Party approach. And I will talk about it. And Bonomi, I mentioned that at the beginning, that Bonomi eventually came back as chair of the CLN, and then became prime minister under the Badoglio government. So there's a lot to talk about. We'll come back at another point. You did mention, however, right at the beginning, you said that quite recently families of those people who were killed attempted to sue the Communist Party for responsibility, or take a case of the Communist Party for responsibility for carrying out the Ardeatine, the Via Rasella bombing. Tell us a little bit about that, James, before we go.
Okay. Well, that I mentioned originally to illustrate this thing about it's still a controversy. Obviously, the Ardeatine Caves massacre is not a controversy. Everybody can agree that that is a bad thing. Whether it was a good idea to carry out the attack on Via Rasella is the debatable thing, which is why, say, if you look at Peter Tompkins, his reaction when he heard about it, and he was trying to free his radio operator, Maurizio Giglio, who's trying to do a rescue operation, and he hears this bomb go up, and he thinks it's brilliantly executed, it's very, very brave and courageous, but was that the best target? Couldn't he have just killed Kappler? Couldn't he have hit Via Tasso? And other groups as well showed that feeling with the reaction. The Bandiera Rossa were the biggest group who were hit by the reprisals at the Ardeatine Caves. And they were the ones who say were exclusively fighting outside Rome. And they had also, on many occasions, they'd managed to free their own guys. They had attacked Forte Brevetta, and they had also raided the lorries going out there and freed their comrades. So, the Bandiera Rossa were not happy about what happened. But another group not happy, 1949, so it's just 5 years afterwards, the injured people who were injured in Via Rasella, and the relatives from the Ardeatine Caves massacres, they did try and sue the Pertini, Sandro Pertini. Amendola, we mentioned, as the head of the Communist Party. Sandro Pertini, I don't know if we mentioned, he was the head of the Socialist Party. He later became president. So he was the ones, and the gap at Via Rasella, they tried. And the court came down with the sentence that it was a legitimate military target. And at that point, they stopped the case. I think the controversy is, yes, okay, it was a military target. Was it the best military target to choose? And that's where, we've got to be careful not to get into too much controversy. But I would add that you mentioned correctly Piero Zuccheretti, the 13-year-old boy who was supposedly killed on Via Rasella, okay? In the 1990s, Il Tempo, the magazine, the newspaper Il Tempo, big Italian newspaper, they printed a picture saying this is the picture of Zuccheretti, who's killed at Via Rasella. And Rosario Bentivegna, who was part of the GAP, who's the one who set the bomb off, he sued them, and he ended up having to pay costs. So they're still discussing, which is why, it's very difficult to give a definitive answer on things. We know it's controversial, and people, as ever, they will use history to back up their own particular political vision. And some people who question the Ardeatine, the Rasella attack are dismissed as fascist or whatever. People who support it often for their own reasons say yes, it was justified. All I can say, looking at all these different things, is the more you look into them, the more complicated they get.
Well, that's it for this week in the Italian campaign. We'll be back next week. So until next time, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.